of Unwired, and Bob Gaudreau, who is from the Regus Group. They will be talking to you about some research that they have done recently. Thank you.
Sorry, I've got a little tangle of wires here.
Thank you, Cindy, and good afternoon. The idea of the next session is to take you through a journey of some research we are going to launch today called V-Work. And this research was the culmination of a range of activities. I think the most interesting was a follow-on from some work we did last year, which we talked about at Worktech New York and other venues, called Agility at Work, where we identified what we called the corporate six-pack, 6 key forces that were reshaping the world of work and influencing how companies would work. And we felt that they were the right trends, but we wanted to kind of hear from organizations as to how they were adapting to those forces and how they would begin to generate the business case to change the world of work. And to do this, we invited 18 global heads of property to a chateau in the south of France. A hard life, you might, but it was some work. But it ended up being called the Burns Summit because over 2 days, these heads of property, who together controlled an astonishing almost 250 million square feet of property around the globe, came up with some great ideas as to how you begin to monetize agility, how we can put a figure, a bottom line, hard-nosed figure, on some of the business benefits about future work and new work styles. We then surveyed 600 people across the globe from all regions and different job functions. And some of the results of all that work are in this report, and it's available for free at the Regus stand. And I guess what we found is that we called this the 3 Vs, and it follows Nicole's idea about virtual really well. But we looked at the idea of advantage, how companies would gain competitive or cost advantage, and then this idea of value. How do you put a bottom line figure on the world that we're heading towards of agility? I think the Vs kind of come to symbolize, I think, some of the kind of mechanisms we need to adopt. Because I think virtual really grabs what you've heard from Nicole. It doesn't kind of counter what Larry was saying this morning, because it does build on the idea that it's about people and people who need to work together wherever they are. So the idea of virtual builds on the technologies you've heard about this morning. It builds on what Nicole has shown you. And it builds on a roadmap towards people being always on, always connected, both in physical space, but also outside of physical space. And we looked at some of the work of Anil Gupta. I'm sure many of you know him. He's a well-known writer on organizational futures in the States and was at INSEAD recently. And some of the work he's been doing recently is about challenging the notion of the corporate headquarters. And I think his quote is interesting. The concept of a corporate HQ will change from a physical location to a virtual network. And he very much sees that being the kind of predominant model for major Fortune and FTSE companies going forwards. And I guess the reason behind it is people. Some of the people who are interviewed in here, they reported that most of our bosses are overseas. We don't physically co-locate now with the people we report to. And I guess what we're finding is people in networks are now able to connect in ways that were not possible even 2 or 3 years ago. The kind of common construct that work is no longer a place, it's a verb, it's something we do. It doesn't get confined to a desk or a cube. It's something that can be done anywhere through a variety of mechanisms, I think now becomes very real. And what we found is that when we identified those 600 people, we didn't find much change. 63.5% of people that we identified in the survey globally still commute into an office 5 days a week. So while we talk about virtual work and mobility and agility, it's not a reality for those people. But surprisingly, only 1.6% of people we surveyed work from home. So that vision of, as you heard this morning, of this mass move to home working is well away from reality. But then you look at the United Nations, you look at the figures that they're showing us, and the world's urban populations that was touched on this morning are doubling. They're heading to 6.5 billion. It means that many of our cities will become immobile. And that immobility comes from the idea of commuting, the idea that everyone has to come into a central city point at the same time each day. And surprisingly, in the survey, we found that people were having that massive amount of time each day getting to a center of a city. So 32% had a 41-minute to an hour journey. Almost 30% spent over an hour each way, 2 hours a day, commuting into their workforce. When we asked them, though, would you like to work at home and not commute, most people said no. only 12% of the global survey said we actually want to work at home. So what's going on, we think, is very different. There's an ideal commute, which we asked about, which we seem to think is between 10 and 20 minutes. People want to leave the home, but they want to work in their community. And therefore, one of the key findings from the survey is the idea of new space, third space, co-worker facilities, which is outside of the office, outside of the home, but perhaps is a new product that needs to come to market. You look at someone like Daniel Pink, the US kind of futurist, and he and others predict now that 40% of the US workforce will be what's called contingent workers, not full-time employees, wanting to work on an ad hoc basis, to collaborate and so on. And therefore, you've seen from Peter and others this morning, and Relina, some of the real challenges from technology to change how we work. The drivers have changed from video to portable devices. The massive move in communications here, Microsoft, to social networking and presence, the jelly bean, kind of permeating everything we do. When emails come in, automatic feeds from Facebook, from LinkedIn, from your internal social networks, add to your knowledge about people and who they are and what they're doing. And of course, this network is one that we see really kind of contributing to the idea of accelerating, or as one of our participants said, pathological collaboration at the Bern Summit. And we have this idea of the jelly bean office, the jelly bean working, which basically tells people who's on, who's alive, where they are, if they are able to be connected to in real time, regardless of their location. And of course, it's being driven into the cloud. So all of those trends kind of summarize this potential for virtual. But let's come back to Larry's point. What about people? What about the real? And I think Stephen Johnson's, the New York writer, his recent book summarizes it very well. He's tracked innovation for 200 years. And he says that it doesn't spring out of the kind of individual eureka moment. As he says, it springs out of the adjacent possible. The most innovative places are hives of activity. So people still do need to be physically co-locating together. They need to kind of smell and see the knowledge in the air, as Larry explained earlier. So we have this kind of really interesting dilemma between people not wanting to all come into the city at the same time, between the tools coming for virtual, but the need of the real. In the survey, we also found that 60% of people now think they have the right technology to work anywhere. And that's a remarkable change from the past. And most companies of the larger organizations we surveyed, over 1,000 employees, have now rolled out some kind of change in a new ways of working program. So the business benefits, again, we asked the 600 people how they would rank the core business benefits that could be derived from new ways of working. And again, you can read the detail in here, but it's interesting that it's about people. The number one by size of company, irrespective of geography, is about productivity of people. And then the rankings go down, as you can see. But how we quantify and measure that, I think, will be critical. The other interesting finding I'll share with you is that 71% of people who work for large organizations strongly believe that the next generation will reject the office of today and begin to more work in virtual patterns and virtual ways. So they're the ones creating workplaces, and they are accepting that those that will come into the workforce will expect very different ideas in the future. So the summary from the study of the advantage that companies will achieve is here. And I think, as you'll see from Bob's message in value and quantifying this, the reduction of property is going to be huge. And almost 60% of the people we surveyed see a reduction in the amount of real estate they'll need to lease in the future, with very few seeing an increase. And most people, just over half in fact, said the office will become much more a place for occasional work. So we have all of these forces at play. We have the ability to become more virtual. We have the ability to kind of begin to quantify the advantage to companies. The critical question, of course, is that how do you make a bottom line figure? How do you become hard-nosed, show the CFO a value to this? And I'll pass over to Bob, who'll talk through the ideas we've got about that.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, great. So it all started with value. I was lucky enough to be at the Bern Summit that Philip's referring to. We were on 500 acres of wine country in the Provence in the south of France. And I'm wondering, Nicole, how it would work in your virtual world, where I'd be at a virtual winery in the south of France and not actually enjoying all those rosés.